Okay, so a couple things before we get going here. We're gonna have a lot of time. We're gonna miss stuff if we don't start now. Okay. So this Monday, in the mentioned last class, I had an announcement posted the Thursday before. You got that Canvas discussion. I'll try to revisit it at the end of class today. It's gonna be a little more help. That's due by the end of the day Monday, along with your third module quiz and the module 4 reading, which will prep you for next week's material. Okay. Also, just a couple things. I will get an announcement up later today with my office hours for tomorrow that I was adding. I originally thought they'd be 8 to 10. I'm waiting on a response from someone about a meeting that I have to be at. I'm thinking I'm probably going to have to push those office hours to be a little bit later in the day, 11 to 1, 12 to 2, something like that. Look for an announcement on Canvas by sometime early this evening, 5 or 6 o'clock. I should have that response to know exactly what those additional 2 office hours will be tomorrow. Next week, barring any weather, I'll be in my typical kind of office hours, 9:30 to 12:30 next Monday and Wednesday. Also look for an announcement. I just saw an email in between my 2 classes. One of the CL leaders is going to have to cancel their sessions this week. I'll get an announcement up about exactly what daytime location that is. But every daytime location will still have multiple places you can go to. It's just that one of them won't be available. I'll make sure I get that posted as soon as I get back to my office. Okay. Other than that, I think that should take care of housekeeping stuff. Any questions for me before we dive into material here? Okay, so like I said, we got a lot to get through. We'll kind of pick up where we left off, which was we were talking about supply. So I'm going to go through things with supply a little bit quicker because a lot of what we talked about with demand is going to apply here. All right. It's just we have to start to change our mindset. For demand, most of us buy things. We're consumers. Very few of us are producers, right? So everything gets kind of flipped. So just as kind of a reminder, when we're thinking about supply, right? I want to start to make sure I'm thinking about, I've got my supply equation. We left off with it looks something like this. So it's telling me that relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. We said the price that comes from the demand curve tells us the consumer's what? Marginal benefit. The price from our supply equation is essentially telling us the producer's marginal cost of supplying different units. So if I wanted to know the marginal cost of the first unit, I plug a 1 into quantity, and I would get the first price that producer is willing to supply the first unit would be what? 0.33 repeated here. If I then wanted the marginal cost of the 9th unit, I just plug 9 into my supply equation. That first price that they're willing to supply that 9th unit for, that's telling me it must be when that price is exactly equal to their marginal cost, or that price is telling me the marginal cost of that unit. So here, we said, as I want to supply more and more of the market, I'm going to require, because every unit I produce, I'm relying on less and less efficient resources. Every additional unit, I'm going to have to require a higher and higher price because my marginal costs are increasing as I produce more and more. So that's kind of where we left off, right? We'll start to think about, just like with demand, we had things that shifted our supply or demand curve. We have things that will shift our supply curve, okay? So let's think about if I've got my supply curve, which we know represents our marginal costs. It's always upward sloping because we said as we produce more and more, we're relying on less and less efficient resources to produce one additional unit. It's continually going to cost me more and more to make that. So what happens, right? Some things that might shift our supply curve. Let's say I think about input prices. So I'll give you a couple examples. So maybe this is like I'm producing children's toys and all of a sudden the price of plastic goes way up. Right? Or maybe I'm a fast food place and all of a sudden the minimum wage goes way up. In either scenario, to produce the same quantity I was before, I'm now going to have to pay a higher price. My input prices have went up. If at every single quantity, my input prices or the labor, raw materials, everything it took to produce this good have went up. It's essentially like at every quantity, what happened to the marginal cost of that unit? It is now higher. And that would be true regardless of what quantity I'm looking at. So when input prices go up, essentially, what has happened to our supply curve? Well, if it costs me more to produce something, am I going to produce more or less than before? Less. So here, this is where it gets a little bit counterintuitive. Our supply curve here decreased. Intuitively, it makes sense that when input prices went up, supply decreased. What's not intuitive is it looks like it shifted upward. This is why last class I was careful with the terminology I was using, and I said the demand kind of corresponded to the same thing as supply. When I see shifts to the left, what am I getting closer to? 0. So I'm seeing a supply decrease. Just like when demand shifted to the left, that was a demand decrease. Any questions? So I would try not to use or think of this the way of inward, outward, upward, downward. I would think of as left and right. Shifts to the left or decreases, shifts to the right, increases. So what's another thing that could change that might be related to input prices that might increase supply? Well, if all of a sudden my input prices go down, that would also cause an increase in supply. But one very specific thing that is going to cause input prices to go down is if I see improvements in technology. So this is anything like customer service and support right now. With the explosion of generative AI, what do you think is happening to their costs of providing the same amount of support? It's going way. Well, they now can rely on ChatGPT. They don't even have to pay a worker. So their input prices are going way down, right? So technology improvements, it's really going to influence the supply curve through input prices. When technology advancements happen, input prices go down. So now at every quantity, my marginal costs are now lower, or I've shifted the entire supply curve. If input prices are lower, am I going to want to provide less or more than before? More. So this is causing supply increases, which are shifts to the right, getting further from that 0. So this is why I use the term of left and rightward shifts correspond to decreases and increases. Because once again, it's kind of confusing. An increase in supply, it looks like it shifted down, right? So don't use up and down, right? Is a kind of a summary of that. Okay. Now, for the sake of these examples, just to make a point, I likely am only going to ever give you examples where you see technology improvements. Can technology development happen? Yes. You know, the Egyptians might be a good example of this. But more often than not, we're thinking about just technology improvements. But we could see input prices go down if we had something, or sorry, we could see input prices go up if for some reason all of a sudden a resource becomes very scarce, right? So here we've kind of got increases and decreases in our supply curve, just like we had for demand. Okay. Now, I use these kind of two categories of supply shifters. We'll take a little bit of a step back. We talked about supply curve represents these marginal costs. The marginal costs are increasing. Now, one thing that I didn't bring up, but hopefully it's kind of easy after what we talked about with demand. With demand, we said we have every individual's demand curve. How do we get market demand? At every single price, I add up how much each person was willing to consume. Same thing for market supply. At every price to get market supply, in this simple 2-firm example, I would simply add up the quantity supplied of each firm. That gives me my market supply. So what do you think happens if I add a third firm here? Market supply, this combination of price and quantity supplied to market, that's my supply curve. If I add more firms, what's going to happen to my supply curve? At every price, I'm now going to see the market quantity supplied is higher, or I'm going to get a supply increase. So just like adding more consumers, more buyers increase our demand, adding more producers or more firms is going to increase our supply curve, right? So if I take market supply, right, we already talked about what decreases and increases in our supply look like. Once again, I don't really like to use these kind of arrows. I will just kind of draw left and right. I know the book uses these like, I don't know, on an angle arrows. I'm only ever going to draw this out like left and right because I think that makes it a lot, excuse me, easier to kind of comprehend. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving here? I'm going through some of this a little quicker, so I save time for stuff that's a little more complicated in this module. Okay. So we already talked through input prices. I gave some examples, but you can think of like my stupid example of like these drinks from Starbucks. If they require milk and all of a sudden the price of milk skyrockets, am I going to be more or less likely to produce these drinks that require milk? Less likely, right? So when my input prices go up, I'm going to see that the supply decreases, or vice versa. If input prices all of a sudden plummet, I'm going to see that the supply goes up for those products. Okay. And then we talked about really what's related to this. So I drew this out already for us. Technology, right? Once again, all the examples I can think of in the current world, we're only seeing technology improvements, which should just increase the supply, right? It lowers input prices. Those two kind of categories are highly linked. Okay. If I have time, maybe we'll kind of revisit this for something that might be a counterintuitive. And then we talked about the number of sellers. Once again, I think this one's relatively easy based off of what we talked about with the demand curve. So we don't probably need to spend a lot of time. More producers, more firms, increases supply. If for some reason we see fewer producers, that would decrease supply. And we draw increases or decreases supply the same way that we were before. Now, one thing that might be a little bit more tricky, because we have to start thinking about supply through the mindset of a firm. So the first thing, I'll use an example of a market expectation. It's kind of a catch-all category. It would look very different depending on the good we're looking at. So I was thinking about natural gas. So let's say ahead of this winter, I saw that it was forecasted to be a much worse winter in Bloomington than it usually is. So I'll tell you right now, I've only been here for, this is my third winter. I think maybe we got, first when I was here, there might have been like one time we got 2 inches of snow. It's just like the fact that we got this much, it's been, the level of cold is nothing like what it usually is. It's much more temperate. I mean, it's still cold, but it's likely not near as cold as it is this week. So let's say ahead of time, the forecasters are saying it's going to be a really cold winter. What does that mean? I know that people are going to be willing to pay high prices for natural gas come this winter. So in the summer, what might I try to do? If I think that there's going to be, I'm able to sell natural gas for higher prices this winter, do I want to sell it then or now during the summer? I want to sell it later when the price is high. Price to the firm is a good thing. So here, what would I do in the summer? I'd stockpile my natural gas so I can sell it in the future. So if I think the price is going to be higher in the future, what happens to current supply? It decreases. Right? So these market expectations are basically going to be related to the expected prices. Every good, there's going to be something different. So I'll give you another example of market expectations. I think I mentioned this probably already before. I mentioned things that are mild. So my brother buys and sells sports cars. Right? This is his hobby. Right? And there's all these things of like, if someone's going to, play in the Super Bowl or something like that, you might expect that in the future, the price you could sell that sports car for is going to go up. So what does everybody do today? They don't try to sell it today. When you think the price is going to be higher in the future, your current supply goes down. Now, if I think prices are going to be lower in the future, what do I want to make sure I do? Well, I don't want to sell. Price is a good thing to me as a firm. So if I think I'm not going to be able to charge, like, let's take up the example I used last class, these dumb fidget spinners that were a fad for a while. So most fad goods, if I'm a company, I don't think that fad's going to last. I think in the future, I'm not going to be able to sell these fidget spinners at all. The price is going to be really low. What do I make sure I do? So supply a lot today, right? So lower expected prices mean current supply will get skyrocketed. I was thinking of this, this is like my economist mindset. I was driving around after the national championship, and on like a bunch of corners, I saw all these pop-up tents where people have like screen printed their own IU national championship t-shirts. Because what do they expect? They expect a year from now, what do you think the price they can charge for those shirts is going to be? A lot lower. Right now, it's probably at its peak. So what do I want to make sure I do? I don't want to sell it in the future when the price is low. I want to sell it right now. Current supply would increase. So we kind of have current supply and price expectations for producers work in inverse or kind of inversely related or work in opposite directions there. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Yeah. Huh? So an increase in supply would be a what word shift? We said increase, we're getting further away from zero, so it would be a rightward shift. Decreases in supply, no matter what is causing that decrease in supply, I'm always getting closer to that 0 point, so that is a leftward shift. Okay. So we're talking about these things that increase or decrease supply. It's always drawn the same way. Rightward shifts are increases, leftward shifts are decreases. Okay. Any other questions at this point? All right, so got something screwed up in my slides, but we'll start to talk through substitutes and kind of complements in production. So I'll walk through a few examples of this. Okay. So let's say, and we're just going to get more practice drawing these shifts. Okay. So let's say I have two goods. I don't know why I like this example today, but let's say I'm a pharmaceutical company and I've got my supply and my price of drug A, right? Maybe I was producing vaccines or something like that. I was maybe producing the polio vaccine. All of a sudden, COVID comes up, and my production process is set up so that I could really produce any drug, right? It's set up so that I can just put the chemical composition, pop the plastic things to make the pill, whatever, stamp them. My production process, there are many, many different goods, or many, many different pills I could be producing. So I'm thinking about, I've got substitutes in production. I can set up my production process really to produce any drug. If all of a sudden the price of drug B goes way up, what do I want to switch my production process towards? Well, if I can, this is where we got to be careful. I'm not a consumer, I'm a producer. So I want to sell the drug that has a higher price. If drug B has this increase in its price, like the COVID vaccine did, what happens to the production of other vaccines? It actually went down. In fact, there were shortages in some vaccines over COVID because these companies, right, when I can produce the COVID vaccine and sell it for a higher price, I stop producing this other vaccine or this other drug. I get a supply decrease or a shift to the left. And then the opposite would be true if the price of a substitute in production fell. So I could use another example, like maybe my production process is set up so that I can create gas or electric vehicles. If electric vehicles, all of a sudden, the price goes way down, what's going to happen to my production of gas vehicles? I'm going to switch my production process over to producing the thing that is now relatively has a higher price. So I see the supply of gas vehicles go up in that scenario. So it could be increases or decreases in that substitute in production good. And that's going to be a little bit different than substitutes in consumption. Okay? Because for consumers, price is a bad thing. For producers, price is a good thing. Any questions on that before we move to the next category? Okay, so just to kind of round this out, if I had this price change, right, the supply of the other good. So if I was going to write this out more generally, an increase in the price of good Y is going to cause a decrease in the supply of good X. And then vice versa, decreases in Y are going to cause increases in the supply of good X. I just use a specific example here. So the next type of goods we're going to talk about, and I used to have a really hard time coming up with like good relevant examples, but then I was out at a distillery in Indianapolis called Hotel Tango, right? And so they produce whiskey, right? So I'm talking to the guy, and he's telling me, and this was like kind of around COVID times. Not really sure if they were supposed to be open or not. Who knows? But I was there, and they're like, "Well, look, when we produce this whiskey, or when liquor is produced, inherently a byproduct that you get is like pure alcohol, some kind of thing that comes up top. It's pure alcohol. Well, what can pure alcohol be used for? Not a lot. I can't consume it. It literally kill me, right? So a lot of the times they just dump it. Well, over COVID, what they realized was actually this byproduct of pure alcohol, it's basically hand sanitizer. So what happened over COVID? The price of hand sanitizer went way up. It was the price of some other good. Okay? So if now I have this byproduct, by producing whiskey, I get pure alcohol, which I can now sell as hand sanitizer for more money. Do I want to produce more or less whiskey than I was before? More, because I'm now getting this byproduct that is even worth, I can actually sell. Before I couldn't sell it for anything. The price is essentially zero. Now there's such a high price, I can sell it, right, as this other good. So what's going to happen? The supply of whiskey, the other good, right, X, what they said was they actually ramped up or increased their production of whiskey, right? That even though that good didn't experience a price change, it was a price change in the byproduct, it caused a change in it. So this is the idea of complements in production. By producing whiskey, I inherently get this other kind of good of hand sanitizer. Maybe another example I used to use, because I thought this was kind of a little more fun. But if I'm creating 2x4s, like lumber, what's an inherent complement in production good I get? Sawdust. If all of a sudden, I don't know, for some reason people want to buy sawdust and they're willing to pay high prices, what am I going to produce more of? To get that sawdust, I need to produce more 2x4s or lumber, right? So there's not a lot of examples. There's a lot more examples of complements in consumption, but we do have complements in production examples, right? Any questions? And I was thinking about this today. There's probably people who are much more well-versed in like agricultural products. I'm sure there's a lot of examples there that I'm just not aware of. But this is the idea of substitutes versus complements in production. Okay. Yeah. So we haven't talked about this yet, but anytime we see shifts in supply or demand, it'll ultimately change the market price that we see for that good. So hold off on this idea. We'll kind of talk through this later on today.
But like, they account for the fact that like, since they're producing so much from whiskey just for the hand sanitizer, they could have extra whiskey just fine.
Potentially, I would see that I ramp up the supply. If the price gets high enough, I don't care that I have extra units of whiskey because I'm selling hand sanitizer for such a higher price, right? So like in theory, what do they do? You're going to weigh out how much money you're making overall, right? But in terms of that relationship with the price and the supply, it'll always be the same. All right. So while we wait for this to come back on, I'm just going to switch back over to our slides anyways. So we kind of have this summary of substitutes and complements in production. The other thing I'll talk about, and I'll go through this just quickly because I think that we don't need to waste as much, or shouldn't say waste, spend as much time on it based on what we talked about with demand. If I tax producers instead of consumers, so let's say something like the production of oil, it causes a lot of pollution, right? So what do we see governments do? They tax the production of it. What does a tax on something inherently do? We've already talked about it. Now to produce the same amount of oil, I have now done what? The term. They're going to have to pay whatever they were before to produce it, plus the tax. So what have I done to input prices with a tax on producers? I've increased it. If I increase input prices, we said supply would decrease. So taxes are really just another input price. Okay. So we kind of see it's like the same idea as what we were talking about before. So if I want to produce something and I've got to pay a tax on every unit I produce, we're going to see that raises my cost. I'm willing to supply less than I was before. We draw it out the same way. Supply decrease, shift to the left. Now, if I subsidize something, right? So I use an example last class of subsidy consumers. You consume public education, you're given money for doing it. Now, suppliers, maybe I want to incentivize the creation of certain things. So Indiana example is a lot of agricultural products, the government subsidizes. They give people money for producing more of these products, right? So if I have a subsidy given to corn production and I have a field, am I more or less likely to want to plant corn there? More, right? Whatever I'm subsidizing, I'm going to see that people want to supply more than they were before, because essentially, what does a subsidy do? If it cost me $100 to produce this before, and I was willing to produce it, now if I produce it, it takes the same $100, but if I'm getting $30 from the government, it really only cost me $7, right? So essentially, subsidies are lowering input prices. So you'll see a lot of stuff with supply. It's just different things that come back to. It's changing our input prices, right? Same idea with taxes and subsidies here. Okay. So we've got everything kind of summarized in terms of what would cause increases, rightward shifts in supply, or decreases, leftward shifts in supply. Okay. And we'll use these shifts kind of later on in class. Right? So we'll get more experience and more practice with it. So the next topic that we're going to move to, and for right now, I'm going to tell you what it is, and then I'm going to give you two ways of thinking about why it is what it is. Right? So for now, just bear with me, trust me what I'm saying. Okay? So I've got supply, I've got demand. Well, I have competing effects. When the price is high, I know that more firms want to produce this. When the price is high, I know that not many people want to buy. So why is the price that we see of a certain good, why is the price of a bottle of water about $1? Why is the quantity sold that we see $1 million or 1 million kind of bottles of water, right? How do we arrive at what we call the equilibrium of a good for whatever specific market we're looking at? Okay. So basically, this equilibrium point, or where a market will arrive at, is where supply is intersecting with our demand curve. So visually, right, we could think about, what is this going to look like? Well, if I draw my supply and demand curve, it's simply that quantity where supply is equal to demand. Or it's the price where the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. We're at the same quantity on both our supply and our demand curve. So we can get this visually from a graph. It's just the point where these two lines intersect, right? Or I can get it from a table. Notice when the price is low, more people want to buy this good than what is currently being supplied. In fact, if the price of something is 0, how many people want to provide that to the market? 0, right? But if the price was 0, how many people want to buy it? Quite a few, right? So initially at low prices, the quantity demanded, right, is going to be really high, and the quantity supplied is going to be really low. Right? Now, how do we identify the equilibrium? From a table, it's going to be the price where the quantity supplied is exactly equal to my quantity demanded, which essentially visually is just represented by where the supply and demand curve intersect. So I can get this equilibrium from a table, or I can get it from kind of this nice visual graph of this table, right? The combination of price and quantity demanded was our demand curve. Combinations of price and market supply is our supply curve. Okay, so we'll then kind of think about surpluses and shortages. But before we do that, I want to try to give you some intuition as why we arrive at that equilibrium point. Okay? So let's say I've got this market, and here's my supply, here's my demand curve. Demand represents marginal benefits, supply represents marginal costs. So if I didn't know this concept of the equilibrium, let's just assume that the current price, right, that I see for this good is right here. Okay. Well, if I'm looking at this price and I'm looking at how many people are willing to buy this good. Okay. At this price, let's say 50 units are being sold. But we assume that we have these markets where we had many sellers, many buyers. If I'm a firm in this market, if I instead charge a slightly lower price, what do I know all consumers are going to want to do? Buy from me, right? Because I'm charging a lower price. Now, what was my marginal cost? Well, even though this price was above my marginal cost, so is this one. So you can almost think about it, even if I'm the firm that lowers the price, this isn't quite right. We'll talk more about how we calculate profits later on in the semester. But you can kind of think about it as the difference between the price and my marginal cost for a firm should represent or be somewhat related to the profits I'm earning. So if I lower the price, everybody buys from me, I'm still earning positive profits. And now I'm not competing with every other firm because I've lowered the price. Everybody wants to buy from me. Well, what's then going to happen? If firm 2 lowered the price, firm 3 is going to say, well, hey, if I charge a slightly lower price, everybody's going to want to buy from me. And that price, the marginal benefit to the producer, is still above their marginal cost. Now they're going to be earning a positive profit and everyone's buying from them. Well, this kind of continues all the way until we get to that point where we're charging a price where the marginal benefit to me as a producer, the price, is exactly equal to my marginal cost. We would say firms are indifferent at this point. We think of it almost as what's the profit earned for that quantity? 0. They're no better, they're no worse off. Now we know they'll never go past that point because if I continue to lower the price, what is now true? My marginal costs are now way above that price. So in this kind of undercutting of each other's price, we know that we would end up at this equilibrium. Here's another way of thinking about it related instead to the idea of surpluses and shortages. Okay? So holding all other factors constant, if I'm looking at a market, and currently, we'll assume once again, we don't know this idea of equilibrium and the market is not in equilibrium. So let's first do, we'll do a lower price. Right? So let's say the current price of this good is somewhere like this. What would the quantity supplied be? Well, it would be the point that we're at on our supply curve. At this current price, my marginal cost at any unit past this, my marginal cost would be above that price. I'd be losing money as a firm. So this is where they would stop. Now, the consumers at this lower price, how much are they willing to buy? Well, the quantity demanded is much higher, right, for consumers compared to the quantity supplied. So if this is the case, the amount being provided to the market is less. You can almost think about it. There's only 10 units on the market. 50 people want to buy it. Here, what would I say I have? A shortage, right? More people want to buy this good than what are currently buying. Or sorry, more people want to buy this good than what is currently being provided or produced. Okay? So what's going to happen? Well, if there's people out there that want to buy this good, as a firm, what am I going to do? Well, in order to produce past this point, what do I need to do? Charge a higher price. So I start charging a higher price. I'm able to sell, right, to more people now. There's still people that are demanding this product, right? So we still would have a shortage, but what has happened to the shortage? It has gotten smaller. So there's still people that want to buy it. There's not enough units. I increase the price even more, right? I'm selling more units. That value of the shortage is getting smaller. This would occur until we get to the point where every unit being produced is exactly equal to the number that is being consumed. We know that they won't increase the price past this point because if they did, let's say I go past that point of equilibrium. What is now true? My quantity demanded is now less than my quantity supplied. So instead of a shortage, if there's more units than are being purchased, I've got units laying around, I have a surplus. Right? So if we have shortages or surpluses, as long as we don't have like government intervention and we allow these markets to kind of operate, we know that producers and consumers will kind of change their habits until we get to that equilibrium point where quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. So this is kind of just another reason to kind of think about why that equilibrium ends up being at that point. Now, got a lot of things going on in this graph. I'll try to simplify to give you kind of a summary of shortages and surpluses. So when we're talking about shortages and surpluses, and maybe it's a more intuitive way of thinking about it. So we know now that we've got supply, which represents marginal costs, demand, which represents marginal benefits. The equilibrium quantity and price should be where those two curves intersect, or where the quantity supplied is exactly equal to my quantity demand. If I ever have prices that are below that equilibrium, so I'm thinking about any price in this range. At any price in this range, what is true about my quantity supplied relative to my quantity demanded? Quantity supplied is less than. So in this range, I know I'm going to have a what? More people want to buy it than what is currently out there. So we would have a shortage. Also, this doesn't here. This is a P here, but I think if I have it clear. Now, how do I end up with a surplus? If I ever see a price above that equilibrium, well, there I know the quantity demanded, the point I'm at in my demand curve, is less than the point that I'm at on my supply curve, or the quantity supplied. So here I would have a surplus. So price is above the equilibrium. I know I'm going to have a surplus. Why? Because higher prices, consumers are going to want to buy less of that. Producers are going to be willing to supply more. We'll always have quantity supply being higher than quantity demand. For lower prices, below that equilibrium, if I have low prices, I know that who's going to want to buy more? Consumers. But at lower prices, suppliers want to supply less. I'm going to end up with shortages. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Well, that helps with the color maybe a little bit. Okay. Okay with this right now? Okay. So we'll kind of keep moving here. We kind of talked through this idea of surpluses and shortages. If I had a table, well, what really was I doing visually? I was saying if the price was $5, the point I was at on my demand curve, or the quantity demanded, was 9. The point I was at on my supply curve, quantity supplied, was 25. So in this scenario, when that price was above the equilibrium of 3, I had a surplus. What was the value of that surplus? Oops, sorry. Simply that difference between my quantity demand and my quantity supply. If I were to then kind of look at lower prices, what should be happening to the value of my surplus? Well, as the price goes down, more people want to buy it, fewer people want to supply it, so that surplus, the difference between quantity demand and quantity supplied, starts to get smaller. Same kind of thing on the flip side, right? So that kind of pushed us all the way down. I drew this out for us, pushed us all the way down to that equilibrium price. If instead, right, we started out with demand being too high, or we have a shortage, what's that going to look like? Well, similar idea. If instead I have this low price of $1, what is my quantity demanded? 21. What is my quantity supply? 5. So 21 people want to buy this good. There's only 5 out there. I have a shortage of 16 units. If I have this shortage, we said what's going to happen? Well, firms start to increase that price, sell more units, but at these higher prices, fewer people want to buy it. So the value of our shortage as we increase the price starts to decrease. This continues all the way up until we get to a price where there is no longer a shortage. So no matter where we start out, there's pressure that pushes us to this equilibrium point. The price where we have no surplus or no shortage, that's what we would call the equilibrium price and quantity. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Okay. All right, so where are we at in time? Let me think through. Okay, we're doing pretty good. So I'm going to skip over this because I'm not going to necessarily expect you to know it. It is something that's kind of related to surplus and shortages that we'll actually talk more about in Module 6. If we have time, sometimes I go through this. For the sake of the questions you'll see on practice problems or on the quiz this week, you don't have to worry about kind of government actions thinking about surpluses and shortages. You just have to think about identifying surpluses and shortages at different prices, or like at a given price, like those we just found. So what we're now going to do is kind of summarize what we've talked about up to this point before we start to talk about things that are going to change that equilibrium point. So other questions that you could be expected to answer if you're looking at the practice problems or thinking about the quiz this week might be worked through in the CL sessions as well. As let's say I've got my demand curve or my demand equation. Oops, sorry. I'm writing and talking. Where I've got price is equal to 100. I think it was at 5Q. Yeah. And then my supply curve was price is equal to 20 plus 15. Okay. So we said that demand, right? This price is telling me the consumer's what? The first price they'd be willing to buy the good must be the price that margin, to them, the price is the marginal cost. So it must be the price that is exactly equal to their marginal benefit. So I can think about if I wanted to know the marginal benefit to the consumer of the fifth unit, how could I find that? Well, price from that demand curve tells me the marginal benefit. So all I would have to do is take that demand curve, plug in the quantity I want to find the marginal benefit of. This is something we did last class, but just to kind of show you a more complete example, I would have what? The marginal benefit would be what, 75 of that fifth unit. Now, just to kind of get at a concept idea, if I wanted to know the marginal benefit of the 10th unit relative to the marginal benefit of the fifth, what value should I find? A value that is, as I buy more of something, my marginal benefit is going down. So hopefully if I go through and plug in a value of 10 here, I find a marginal benefit that is lower than 75. Right? Just to kind of revisit some of these concepts. Now, just like that price from our demand curve reflected the consumer's marginal benefit, what does the price from our supply curve reflect? The producer's marginal cost. Or it's the first price they'd be willing to supply this good. Because to them, price is their marginal benefit. So it's the first price where that marginal benefit must be greater than or equal to their marginal cost. So if, let's say I wanted the marginal cost of the third unit, all I would do is plug in that quantity of 3 into my supply equation, and I get what? The marginal cost of that third unit is 65. So I can use these equations to find the marginal benefit or the marginal cost of a different number of units. So the next type of question we could be asked is, okay, what is the equilibrium of this market? Well, we said visually, I'm really just looking for what? Where my supply curve is equal to my demand curve. So what am I doing? My first step, I'm just going to set supply and demand equal to each other. I know that's the point I'm looking for. If I've got equations, and I don't just want to visually find this, well, what would I plug in for demand here? The demand equation. I'm going to set that equal to then the supply equation. Okay. The next step is I have to do a little bit of algebra, right? So what do? I go, okay, well, move 5Q over to this side, subtract 20 from both sides. I end up with 80 is equal to what? 20Q, divide both sides by 20, and I get that this equilibrium quantity is 4. So set your two equations equal to each other, because that's the point you're looking for on that graph. Use some algebra to solve for what that equilibrium quantity would be, where those two curves, supply and demand, are equal to each other. Now, the third step is I want to find the equilibrium price. So how could I find that? Well, if I know I'm looking at the fourth unit, I would just go back and plug them into either my supply or demand curve. Now, here's a good way to check yourself to make sure you didn't make math mistakes, all right? If I plug this into my supply curve or I plug it into my demand curve, I should get the same price, right? So if I plug this into my demand curve, that quantity of 4, or I plug it into my supply curve, hopefully I get, sure enough, the exact same value. Or this equilibrium price is 80. So I set the two equations equal to each other, use a little bit of algebra, that gives me the equilibrium quantity. I then use that equilibrium quantity, plug it back into either my demand or supply equation, that gives me the equilibrium price. Okay. Questions on that idea? Okay. So I think another question was, what if instead the price was 60? Well, right away, if that price is 60, what should exist? A surplus or a shortage? Well, my quantity supplied is going to be less than my quantity demanded, so I have a shortage. What is the value of that shortage? Well, what would I want to find? I now know the price. So if I use my demand, actually, I should be keeping these colors the same here. If I use my demand curve, if I know the price is 60, how could I find what the corresponding quantity demanded is? Just a little bit of algebra, right? So I do a little bit of algebra here. I get what? Subtract 60, add 5Q. I get 5Q is equal to 40. Divide both sides by 5. I get that the quantity demanded is 8. Right? Now, what if I want to find the quantity supplied? I would simply plug in that hypothetical price of 60 into my supply curve. So I would have what? Something that looks like this. Now it's just a little bit of algebra. Subtract 20 from both sides. Then divide both sides by 15. I get what? 40 over 15 would be my quantity supplied. So that's going to be what? 2.66 repeated. My quantity supplied is less than my quantity demanded. So sure enough, I have a shortage. What's the value of that shortage? Just the difference between the two. So here that'd be what? 5.33 if I'm doing math in my head correct. So here's how we can start to use these equations to think about what these points visually on the graph are telling us, right? Quantity demanded, quantity supplied. I've got a shortage. How much is that shortage? The difference between the two. So I'd probably focus a little bit more, be much more likely to ask you questions on, I give you two equations, ask you then for the equilibrium price. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. Yeah. You gotta speak up a little bit. No, in fact, I'll give you a question on the quiz where I had to randomly generate different intercept and slope values for all of you. All right? Because any, if they were always the same equations, what would be true about the equilibrium price and quantity? Is every good have the same price? No. So we could see these values change. I just chose one hypothetical kind of example here. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah. So that was just a hypothetical value that I had in the slides. So I said, if the price was 60, would we have a surplus or shortage? I could have instead asked you if the price was 100, what's the value of the surplus or shortage? If the price was 20. Sorry if that was, we're bouncing back and forth, but that's where I grabbed that from. Okay. Any other questions before we keep moving here? All right. So we're now going to move to a slightly different topic, kind of combining things we've talked about, which is we now know how to identify the equilibrium price and quantity, but we also have shifts in supply and demand. So if I identify the equilibrium quantity where supply is equal to demand, if one of those shifts, my equilibrium shifts as well. So we're first going to identify what is shifting, right? Is it supply? Is it demand? Or at the very end of class, we'll say it could be both. Now, once I identify what is shifting, what direction is it shifting? Is it increasing or decreasing? Now, given that directional change in whatever we're looking at, supply or demand, how is the equilibrium price and quantity going to change? Okay. So I've got kind of some empty slides set up here. I'll kind of work through some examples. So let's say I've got an example. Here's my current supply. Here's my current demand curve. We'll kind of think about this is where my equilibrium, sorry, I wrote there. Here's where my equilibrium quantity and price start out. Okay. So let's say I have an inferior good and I had an income increase. Well, right away, if I have an inferior good, it's related to income. Who has income? Consumers or producers? Consumers. So I should be thinking about what is shifting in this graph. Demand. I'm thinking about demand. Now, if I have an increase in income for an inferior product, what's happening to demand? As we have more money, we rely less on things like public transportation, buying ramen noodles, so I see a demand decrease. I would use arrows to kind of summarize this for myself. So a demand decrease means that at every price, people are willing to buy less than before. Or we said a demand decrease is a leftward shift, pushing us towards that point of zero. Where is my new equilibrium price and quantity? Well, it's where my new demand curve is equal to my new supply curve. So my new equilibrium price and quantity would be right here. So what has this demand decrease done? It has decreased my equilibrium quantity, and it has also decreased my equilibrium price. Right? So any of those things that change, that decrease our demand curve, would always result in a lower quantity, equilibrium quantity, and a lower equilibrium price. So I'm not going to draw it out. I've got it in the slides. But if I saw instead a demand increase, what do you think that's going to do to my equilibrium quantity and price? If a demand decrease caused them both to go down, a demand increase is going to do what? Cause them both to go up. So we can draw these demand increases or decreases, compare our original equilibrium point to our new one, and what we'll see is demand decreases always push those equilibrium quantity and prices down. Demand increases always push those equilibrium quantities and prices up.
It's possible to go, I don't know, just go back to the steps.
They're in the slides, right? So this is why I give you the slides, but I mean, you can take some time out, but right? What did we do, right? We identified first, I said we have income. So who's impacted? Consumers, demand. That was our first step. We then said, okay, income went up, I have inferior good. What direction did demand change? Decrease. Once I have that decrease in demand, I draw up my graph. How did that change my equilibrium price and quantity? Okay. All right. So this is what our kind of demand shifts look like. Yeah. Do movements along the curve?
Like the equilibrium at all?
No. So if I had like a change in the price of this good, it would just cause me to be out of equilibrium, right? Because I know that if I'm at the current equilibrium price, if the price goes up or down, and I'm just moving to different points on the supply and demand curve, what's going to occur? I'm going to have a shortage or a surplus. So a change in the price of the good you're looking at That's going to move you to different points on the supply or on the demand curve. That would push us out of equilibrium or create surplus. Any changes in any of those things that we talked about that impact the demand curve or the supply curve that cause shifts, that's what's going to change our equilibrium. Yep. It's a good question. Any other questions we have before we keep moving here? Okay. So if instead, right, I think about supply shifts, and just to kind of do one real quick, how would I do this, right? So if I've got my current equilibrium point, right, and let's say I had something, let's say I have more producers, more firms. What is that going to do? So if I have more producers, the word of producers should tell me that what's going to shift? Supply. More producers means that my market supply curve is going to go up, which is where I have to be careful. Because supply increases are actually going to look like rightward or kind of downward shifts. We want to be careful there. Now, what has that done to my equilibrium price and quantity? It's caused my equilibrium quantity to go up, but my equilibrium price to go down. And then kind of just like with demand, you can imagine if I instead had something that caused a supply decrease, that's going to cause the equilibrium quantity to go down, but the equilibrium price to go up. And we could draw that out if we want. So kind of thinking about these supply and demand shifts that we've talked about, how to draw them, we can now understand how that's going to change my equilibrium price and quantity. So here's where I want to give you guys a little bit of time to kind of work through this on your own. So I'm going to go here, just looking at time. I'm going to change this to 1040. I'm going to publish it. So it now should show up on the home page of Canvas, right? So we scroll down here, in class quiz 3.2, the code that will get you in, the score of the IU Purdue game, which is 72.67. Okay, so 72.67 will get you into this quiz. I'm not going to work through these with you today. So I'm going to give you about the next 5 minutes or so. Talk to the people around you. Here, all I'm asking you for is I have these different things that are changing, and I don't even want you to tell me the change to the equilibrium price and quantity. They're depicted for you, but basically, when these things occur, what is going to cause, is this going to be a shift in demand or supply, and which of the visual depictions represent that? So you've got 3 different examples. Only think about the change that you're given in that problem. Don't assume anything else about those goods. So once again, I'll give you about the next 5 minutes to work on this. I'll then prompt you to make sure that you're kind of turning this in time, and then we'll kind of go through one last topic to end class. Okay? So once again, only assume what you're given in the problem. Okay? So read them carefully.
This is electric vehicle. No, price of gas prices just going down. That means they won't make any gas. This is selling metal. They're gonna make electric. Here's the supplier. Price will be higher. Something. So this is the. This one's not. They're subsidizing the consistent. Oh, yeah.
All right. So this is where I'll tell you the quiz is due at 10:40. So you've got 2 minutes of buffer now. Make sure you're hitting submit on that quiz. And you've answered every single one of those 3 questions. If you get them wrong, you'll still get half credit. If you get them right, you'll get the full credit for those problems. We're not working through them together. It's been nicer in the past. More often than not, I'm going to have you guys work on them. You actually need to get them correct to get the full points. Okay? So make sure you're hitting submit right now. A little bit of buffer. I have it set to be 10:40. If you submit it late, I'm going to assume what? You weren't here. Right? So get it submitted now. I'll now kind of in somewhat review those, but combining them into the final new topic we'll talk about. Okay? So let's assume instead of just a change in one thing that would just impact supply or demand, I see simultaneous shifts. Okay? So if I see simultaneous shifts, I'm going to use 2 of the examples that I believe were given in that problem. Okay? So if I remember correctly, one of them was that we saw the price of gas vehicles go down. Make sure that that's true. Yes. And that these were substitutes in production. So right away, if I'm thinking about, I have this market, I've got my equilibrium, quantity and price. If I see the word production, what should I be thinking about as shipping? I should not have answered any of those graphs that had demand shipping. Producers are supply, consumers are demand. So if I see a decrease in the price of a substitute in production, if I'm producing vehicles and the price of gas vehicles is now lower, am I more or less likely to want to produce those? Less likely. The actual good you were asked about was the market for electric vehicles. It's substitute. So if gas vehicles, the price is lower, I'm going to be more likely to want to produce electric vehicles. So supply would, is that an increase or a decrease? Increase, right? So if I see supply increase, what's going to happen? This wasn't asked in the problem, but if I went one step further, what is happening to my equilibrium quantity and my equilibrium price? Yeah, this supply increase caused my price to go down, but my quantity to go up. Okay. Now, if I had these simultaneous change examples, here's how I would approach them. Right? So here was the first thing that changed. If at the same time, guys, I'm hearing a lot of chatter. Like, so do you think if someone's presenting and you're talking while they are, do you think you're more or less likely for them to give you things like job opportunities? Less likely. I know I can't give you a job opportunity, but when you're doing things like in Kelly, try to treat class like you would those, right? You want to build connections, you want to network, right? So just give me a little bit, right? When the chatter, I don't mind talking. When the chatter gets loud enough to where it's distracting me from what I'm saying and doing, all that means you're doing a little too much of it, okay? So if I have simultaneous changes, this thing is happening at the same time as I'm subsidizing consumers. If I see this word of consumer, what should I be thinking about as shifting? Demand. If I subsidize something, I give people money for doing it, is demand going to increase or decrease? Increase. If I give people more money, they're going to want to do more or buy more than before. So I see an increase in my demand curve or a rightward shift. What did that do to my equilibrium? That caused my equilibrium price to go up, right? So this demand increase caused the equilibrium price to go up and the equilibrium quantity to also go up, okay? So what is the total effect if these happen at the same time? So I would draw them out both separately. The supply increase caused price to go down, quantity to go up. The demand increase caused both the price to go up and the quantity to go up. So if I then think about if these happen at the same time, what is my total effect? Well, if they're both increasing quantity, what has definitely happened to quantity? It's went up. What's happened to my equilibrium price? This is an answer we'll start to see pop up in economics, which is it's indeterminate. I don't know. They're pushing price in opposite directions. So what does it ultimately matter? How do I know if price is going to go up or down? It's which one of these effects is larger. Now, as far as I'll ask you is, I won't tell you which effect is larger, then ask what happens. All you have to identify is that if these simultaneous changes are pushing price in opposite directions, that the answer is it's indeterminate. And the reason why is because if I were to draw these out and I think about here's my original supply and demand curve, okay? If I were to draw these shifts, let's say I draw the same demand shift, right? But my supply shift, if I kind of represent it really small, what does it look like happened to my equilibrium? So the new supply and demand curve looked like it's at a higher price and a higher quantity. But if I drew that supply shift really, really large, right? Well, now my new equilibrium point is way down here. It still looks like quantity went up, but now what does it look like happened to my equilibrium price? That it went down, right? So depending on how large I drew the shifts, I could come up with different answers to what happened to that equilibrium price. If I just kind of do this shorthand, I draw out each shift individually, I can then see, okay, if these simultaneous changes are pushing price in opposite directions, the answer to what happens to price is it depends, or it's indeterminate. Okay? Questions on this idea? So just to give you another idea, or another example, let's say I've got something where, and I won't go through a full example, but just kind of for the sake of time. Let's say I have something that is going to cause, well, we'll do it this way. Let's say I have a demand increase, okay? What did that demand increase do to my equilibrium price and quantity? The demand increase caused both my quantity and my equilibrium price to go up, okay? Now let's assume that simultaneously in the same market that I had something that caused my supply to, what does a leftward shift in supply look or do? It's a leftward shifts closer to zero, so supply is decreasing. Where is my new equilibrium point if that was the only thing that changed? Well, that supply decrease caused my quantity to go down, but my price to go up. Okay? So once again, I could then kind of do the combination of these two things. I could write them out again, or hopefully I can kind of see it here. So what is my total effect? If these happen at the same time, what is definitely going to happen to price? If they're both increasing price, I know the total effect is that price will go up. But here they're pushing in quantity, the quantity in the opposite direction. So what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity? I don't know. Indeterminate. Depends on which of those shifts is larger. Okay? Once again, I won't kind of push you to the next step where if I said the supply shift is larger, then what's going to happen to quantity? Well, its effect would dominate. So there, if I know the supply shift is larger, I know quantity would be lower. I won't go that far. All I'm going to ask you to do is identify it's pushing quantity in opposite directions, so the change is indeterminate. So I use these two examples to make this point. Sometimes it could be that the change in price is indeterminate. Sometimes it's that the change in your equilibrium quantity is indeterminate. I'll give you a little bit of a hint. Any type of example that we have here, so I kind of have a summary of this. If I had simultaneous shifts, so we worked through some examples that are a little bit different from the slides. You could maybe try to work on the example in the slides to see if you can answer. Very similar to what I just did here, with just different, examples of shifts. You'll notice here, like if I have supply and demand increases, I know the quantity is going to be higher, but depending on how I draw those shifts, I don't know what's going to happen to price. So we really have four combinations of demand or supply increases or decreases. Right? There's four combinations. You would solve them out all the exact same way that we just went through these two examples. A little hint is that only one change can be indeterminate at a time. So, for example, I couldn't have both the change in the equilibrium quantity and the change in the equilibrium price both be indeterminate at the same time, right? There is only ever one thing when you have simultaneous shifts. There is only ever one thing that is indeterminate. Okay? You will always be able to for sure say that one thing is either increasing. So I won't give you any example where you have two shifts in demand. It's just simultaneous, one in demand, one in supply. We can complicate it further and have multiple shifts in demand and multiple shifts in supply, in which case it just becomes we have to compare more and more sizes of the effects. Okay? So in the examples I give you, just an effect in supply or just an effect in demand happening at the same time. So one thing I wanted to mention before you get out of here, for that kind of Canvas discussion, just revisiting this once again. So it's this Chat GPT and productivity. That's that first Canvas discussion. I give you some articles to read through. You respond to this initial prompt, answer one or multiple of the questions. I had questions about length. Any well thought out, well constructed response to this likely going to require a couple paragraphs, right? So you'll kind of post your initial response. You'll then access this database. Now, because this is related to productivity, I would probably come down here. I could think about other markets that I think their productivity might be increased. I want to play around with looking at different parts of this database. Here I'm looking at productivity. Maybe I look at productivity and unit labor costs. I think about labor costs being impacted by ChatGPT. What has happened to productivity? Link those numbers that you would then find from any of the tables that you choose, right? Linking some of those numbers in terms of what's happened to productivity over the last 5 years or in different countries. Somehow taking some data you find here, linking it to the kind of top of your post that you made, that's worth 5 points each. The remaining 10 points, you then will respond to two other students' posts. Those can be very short responses as long as they're well thought out, constructive responses to those students' posts. You'll get 5 points for each of these. So your initial post, tying in the data, a response to each, so 2 responses to 2 other students, right? For a total of 20 points. Grade these fairly leniently. It's more for you to kind of get to start to thinking about how to access databases, how to kind of have back and forth over a topic with other people and other students. Other than that, quiz, module reading, and this Canvas discussion due by the end of the day Monday. I'll have office hours tomorrow, which I'll post later, and then my typical office hours on Monday. A fun, safe weekend, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.